these low Earth orbit satellites cannot really provide a service with a single satellite, unlike a geostationary satellite. You need to cover the globe. You can picture the lines of longitude around a traditional globe, and those are how these constellations of satellites also cover the globe. They tend to be polar circling planes, not equatorial, the way traditional geostationary satellites are. Um, they have, again, a very low latency. For example, you can comfortably have a 4G quality conversation on a low Earth orbit satellite. Those satellites are as close or as far away as a transatlantic cable. They're really quite close. Extremely high throughput, again, a 4G quality video connection. It is inherently global. You cannot put up a constellation just to cover New York City or just to cover Africa. These constellations will cover the globe, and that is an interesting opportunity. There's quick manufacture and quick launch. I have a whole slide about that I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide, please. Another graphic to help you visualize the differences. On the left, a traditional geostationary satellite. The incredible value of these satellites is that one satellite can cover a third of the globe. For something like the broadcast of information, whether it is television or simply downloading a new software update for every Kia car in all of the Americas, that can be done with a single satellite, an amazing application for geostationary. Not so good for two-way. So medium Earth orbit, you only need about 8 satellites, and you cover most of the world's population, but not all of it, and not all of the geography. So low Earth orbit, you need hundreds of satellites, frankly, to cover the satellite, to cover the globe. But then you have coverage literally everywhere. Every spot on the ocean, all of the poles, there will be no spot on the globe that will not be covered. And again, not necessarily intentionally, but Starlink has to cover the entire globe in order to also cover the big population areas in India, China, South America. That's just inherent in the architecture of a constellation. Next slide, please. A significant reason the LEO satellites have become so popular in the last, shall we say, 2 to 5 years is basic economics. The supply is cheaper and the demand has increased, right? So 50, 60 years ago, it was only a government and maybe the very largest companies in the world. Big drivers were the national prestige, doing some basic science, some very basic communications, right? Today's space players can create a satellite in a matter of hours. Hours. It used to take a year to build a single satellite by hand. Now, OneWeb, Starlink, I'm sure the Chinese systems are churning out satellites every day, multiple satellites, and there are new launch vehicles that can handle 20 or 30 satellites at a time on the payload. And so you can launch every month a new set of 25 or 50 satellites. You can build the constellation. You can replace aging and dying satellites. It becomes much more of a mass production situation. And at the same time, and this is significant, the demand has increased. The demand for access to the internet while you are mobile. So on your personal device, on a laptop, from anywhere in the world, people expect this now. So a regulator has to think about how to license access to these services for their country. Most of the countries have signed the Outer Space Treaty. It has an obligation to continually supervise your own satellites. But also, even if you are not licensing the satellite system, but merely providing market access, your understanding of how it works will be helpful. Next slide. Every nation will have to regulate the activities that happen in its country, but that may only be the provision of the service and the ground equipment, whether you want to call that a hub or an Earth station or a user terminal. That all gets regulated because it's in your territory. The space station itself will only have a license from the ITU member nation that submitted the paperwork for this constellation, right? So the ITU filing administration may be Rwanda, it may be the United States, but again, these constellations will be accessible from anywhere in the globe. And so every nation will have to think about how to allow access to those satellites for its people. Next slide, please. Bear in mind that that means these constellations, these companies, will be dealing with close to 200 administrations around the world. And the more harmonized the licensing is, the easier it will be for you and your neighboring nations to receive the services. Again, any infrastructure on the ground is yours to license. In the traditional geostationary satellite, most nations wanted to have the receiving gateway in their territory so they could control national security concerns about the security of those communications. With the constellations, you do not need a dish, a gateway antenna in your nation. All you need is a POP, the computer point of presence, where the signal enters your nation and all of the national security and encryption concerns can be handled there. Significantly less expensive than putting in an entire Earth station and just as secure for every nation. It's helpful to your nations if you have recognized the homologation and the equipment has been certified by the EU or the FCC so that your nation does not need to set up a lab to accept these equipments. And the service itself used to be licensed differently. Was it a data service, audio, video? Was there an incumbent, a company within your country offering that service? In some countries, the government itself invested in the satellite systems. And these may still be concerns for your nation. I will point out that the LEOs can offer all of those services. And so again, thinking about your regulation, keep them flexible enough to not specify a type of service. Perhaps think about the quality or the throughput of the service being provided, and that will make it easier to adopt the new systems when they come online. Next slide. Something that some countries do want to concern themselves with, especially if they are the ITU filing administration, is the Liability Convention, this treaty, and ensuring, if not the satellites themselves, any injury to another person, a third party, is how the lawyers and insurance companies describe that. So the satellite causes damage to something on the ground, It happened recently in Kenya. Debris came down. Kenya was not involved in that piece of debris, but if there were damage, who is going to pay for that? And countries usually require that an operator hold some kind of insurance in case of that. Next slide, please. Every country does it differently. So when your nation is thinking about these issues, it's helpful to speak with the ITU or their experts, or even reach out directly to the regulator of another nation to see how they've done the licensing. I just note that in the UK and the US, they do it a little differently. Just as an example, in the UK, the launch vehicle and the satellite, the object, get a license from their civil aviation authority, and the spectrum would come from their spectrum regulator. That's Ofcom. In the USA, only the launch vehicle gets its license from the aviation authority, while the satellite, the object, gets its license from its payload regulator. It gets spectrum from the FCC, or if it is remote sensing, cameras, maps, it gets that license from the National Oceans and Atmospheric Administration, used to do the weather satellites. Some of this is historic. As new technologies come along, each country just sort of sees who's capable of doing the licensing, the oversight, the authority. Whereas a newer regulator, a new spacefaring nation has the opportunity to think about the best way to structure its government, to do it in perhaps a more rational way within your government. The EU has open skies. Any satellite that is launched may shine on their nation. You don't need a license just to land the signal. However, some nations still require a landing right, market access license. In some nations, if you're going to stop operating or to deorbit the satellite, the regulator wants to know, have you affected consumers or retail customers by going out of business? Or will there be any danger while you are deorbiting? So these are things to keep in mind that your government may want to oversee as well. Next slide. This is a very useful slide. I remind everyone that the slides will be available on the Space Connect website very shortly. And I also remind everyone that I do not have the new European IRIS-2, IRIS squared, on this chart, and Dominique will talk about that specifically. These 7 constellations are on their way. The 3 on the left, their columns are green because they have begun operations, or mostly fully operational. Lightspeed has not yet begun operations, but the 3 on the right have begun to launch. They are not quite operational, but they have begun to launch the hundreds of satellites that will be required. The important thing I think to note here is almost all of these use the Ka band, that's 28 to 30 gigahertz, for their communications link. This was a significant fight a few years ago when 5 and 6G terrestrial mobile interests were hoping to use that band for that service. In fact, it is a natural fit for low Earth orbit and even geostationary satellites, truly space-based communication. And all of these systems, I think even the Thousand Sails will have Ka band within it. They are also looking higher Q and E bands for their gateway communications and next generations. So those are the bands of spectrum that will be important. They are at all different altitudes. And that is because the altitude for low Earth orbit, there is no one sweet spot. So if SpaceX is at 550, that's fine. Your constellation could be at 750 or 1,000, and have just as good a quality connection. Next slide, please. This is the last thing I want to point out. So this direct to device concept is very hot around the world. I know that the WRC is looking at it. I believe it's AI 1.13. And that is the idea that you might put the cell phone company um, spectrum allocated for terrestrial cell phones on a satellite, so that when the cell phone company did not have a tower, it could use the satellite as its tower to extend its coverage and cover not spots, as they are called in the UK, or dead zones, or just to extend the coverage into rural and less populated areas. The opposite, or the corollary to that, is putting satellite spectrum in the hardware of the phone. This is how Apple is offering a service that is not dependent on a carrier. And it just says if you have an Apple phone and you are in the middle of nowhere, our phones can now connect directly to satellites, especially in an emergency. The regulators in countries need to think about authorizing these services and how it will best fit with the needs of their country. As engineering gets better, making it possible to go directly from outer space to a traditional phone, not a special satellite phone, but just an ordinary cell phone, it's going to blur the line between allocations for terrestrial cellular and space-based mobile satellite. Okay, last slide, please. Again, because you are regulators, I want to refresh your thinking about the best way to update or adapt your regulations that may have been written specifically for C and KU band geostationary satellites. When talking to these new technologies, new services, remember, it's a conversation, it's a process, licensing. Invite the companies to give you a private workshop and discuss their goals and aims and explain their systems to you. Consider rewarding good behavior as opposed to punishing bad behavior. Make it cheaper if they build quickly, if they build efficiently, if they cover an uncovered area, which serves your goals as a nation to connect your peoples. Be open about what you're doing. Ask your public. We're considering licensing this service. What do you think? Have a good website. People from outside of your office, even within your country, but certainly outside of your office, will wonder what's going on. Is my regulator thinking of allowing Starlink? I have opinions about that. Have the website be clear and simple to follow. And finally, of course, keep in mind the sustainability of the space environment. Let us not pollute that environment to the point where we cannot use it. There is an interagency, a debris mitigation committee that the space agencies of the world have set up, the IADC. They've got very good guidelines. The ITU is having space sustainability meetings. The UN, of course, at Copuos and UNOSA is having discussions about debris, collisions, traffic management. So this is an area that the traditional spectrum regulator also needs to be aware of and paying attention to. And I believe, Patricia and Gretchen, that that is my last slide. I hope it gave a fairly clear overview of the main issues.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was a fantastic introduction about an awfully wide-ranging set of topics that you laid out really helpfully, not just what the considerations are, but also what the challenges are for the future. I don't know how many of you have heard this reference that constellations are the Wild West and that there's just chaos up there. And anyone who looks at Ruth's presentations or any of the subsequent ones can't help but conclude that there's an awful lot of consideration and oversight now. I think the question is it the right oversight? Do we need to update things? How do we make sure that it's faithful to the considerations and the concerns and the priorities that individual countries and the world at large are placing? So, Ruth, you did a fantastic job to get us going. Thank you so much. We're now going to turn to Dominic Hayes for a regional perspective and from the front lines of Europe, where they are deliberating now what the priorities are and how to put those in place. Dominic, over to you.
Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Ruth. I echo what Patricia said about the presentation. I think it was excellent and gives a very good perspective on space constellations and space authorizations in general. So I will now focus a little bit more on the EU perspective, particularly, well, trying to focus on LEO constellations, but in fact, there's a very subtle difference. In fact, even some would say not much of a difference between how we authorize LEO constellations versus how we authorize the existing GEO constellations, for example. Next slide, please. So Ruth has already touched upon some of this. So the Outer Space Treaty really is the bedrock of authorizations of satellites globally. It has the concept of a responsible state, and that responsible state must authorize and supervise any space activities that emanate from their domain. And that will include things like satellite licensing, a launch license for where the launch takes place, and that may be a different country from where the satellite was manufactured. And in fact, this also takes upon the concept of liability. So that liability then becomes shared between the launch country as well as the satellite operator, as well as where the links are for the satellite connections, and that may also have some liability. So the responsibility is not exclusive for the satellite operator, but it really takes into account all of the elements that are involved in putting something into space and operating. And then, back. Thank you. Then at ITU level, of course, we're now talking about frequencies. So we have the radio regulations, which are a treaty text. So like the Outer Space Treaty, it's a treaty level text at UN level. So essentially the baseline there is the table of allocations in appendix 5, is it, of the radio regulations. So that lists a list of what frequencies can be used where and for what purpose. So that's really, we say it's like the radio regulatory Bible that we go to when we're looking for how to use frequencies on a global basis. And then once a satellite company has looked at the table of allocations to see where they could potentially operate in terms of frequency, they will need to submit their parameters to the ITU through a filing process. That filing will list the frequency, the power levels, the orbits, the service area. So this gives a better understanding of where the satellite system will be operating. And it's all about trying to minimize interference. So once the filing process has been completed, that will almost certainly trigger some kind of bilateral coordination with other space actors. Once the bilateral coordination is concluded with all of the affected actors, that entry filing can be then be included in the Master International Frequency Register, MIFA. Essentially then, that legalizes the space segment of any space system. But as Ruth said, many countries will still require separate landing rights for their territories, which adds an extra complication beyond the regular ITU process. Next slide, please. So the size challenge. Well, I'm looking at Europe here because that's where I'm based, and I'm giving the European perspective. But Europe is a big area. Next slide, please. But is it a big area? And if you look here, there's one country in Africa that's covering most of Western Europe. So it's maybe not such a big area. Next slide. And this is Africa. So you can see how Africa compares with Europe. So really you could fit many Europes within the continental space of Africa. So Europe then is relatively small geographically. Next slide. But it's a big market. In fact, it's a multi-billion euro downstream space market. And that makes it worthwhile in operators providing services in Europe, even if it's a fragmented market. And we are composed of 27 member states within the EU, and there are 46 countries within CPT, which is the group of administrations in the European area. So all of these areas may have different national requirements. They may require service provision licenses. So this is even beyond frequency licenses. So this is the license to allow a service to be deployed within a country. For example, offering a broadband service, you may need a service license within an individual country. So this can be very complicated for satellite operators who are wishing to offer service in the EU and the European area in general. Next slide, please. But fortunately, as Ruth said, we have an open skies policy in the EU. So Commission Directive 2002/77 EC essentially removed all the restrictions on the space segment, providing space segment capacity over EU countries. In part of that time, 2002 was driven by the provision of satellite TV services across the EU. And ultimately, this led to no specific landing rights being required to offer services in the EU. But in some cases, it usually requires some kind of authorization for the ground station. And this is really based upon the technical parameters of the ground station. So it could be the power or the antenna sizes, the location. And this is for the uplink. And it really is aimed at avoiding interference to other in-band services. So it's not meant to be a barrier. It's really about trying to ensure that the space services that are being offered don't cause interference to other services that are in the band. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, the complicated situation we have in Europe, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, which is a group of experts from EU member states and EFTA countries, in Europe, have been working on this topic, particularly focused on the single market issues for satellite operations, but also direct-to-device connectivity, which is really now a hot topic. And they've come out with this draft opinion, which is now open for public consultation until the 28th of March. When you get the slides, you will see that there is a link to this draft opinion, and we invite you to offer comments on what has been provided in this draft opinion. So the draft opinion makes a number of recommendations aimed at streamlining provision of satellite services in the EU, with the ultimate aim to ease market access for operators and to simplify the rules and to make things more transparent for those that are wanting to offer service within the EU. So it covers things like spectrum, competition issues, licensing, lawful intercept, security, and a whole host of other topics. One thing that may come out of this is a set of common requirements that operators can use when they are applying for licenses or authorizations within individual member states within the EU. So this is not meant to replace the individual authorizations and licenses that member states will issue, but it's really to help operators have a single set of guidelines that they can use, single set of parameters they know that they have to provide when they are applying for a particular authorization in a country. And by having a single set of rules, it should make it easier for that space operator to provide service or to eventually get to service in the EU. Next slide. One area where we do harmonize at EU level is the 2 GHz MSS bands. So these are a set of bands around the 2 GHz frequency. So it's a 2 by 30 megahertz. It's harmonized at EU level. And in 2009, the European Commission authorized 2 satellite companies to provide MSS services across the EU. The member states then subsequently licensed these 2 companies, and these 2 companies are now gearing up to provide services. And indeed, in fact, if you've flown in Europe, you will perhaps have received services from at least one of these companies while you're flying on one of the suitably equipped aircraft. Service is currently provided by GEO satellites, but nothing precludes the use of LEO and MEO constellations for providing service if the use by these companies, or maybe future companies, evolves to take account of the new dynamic in satellite connectivity. The licenses actually expire in 2027, and with this in mind, the European Commission launched a study to study the 2 gigahertz band, and particularly how they fit into the global framework of satellite connectivity, so we can better understand the best uses for 2 gigahertz. The RSPG, the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, is currently analyzing options for post-2027 in case the situation for licensing needs to be changed in some way. Next slide, please. And as Ruth said, the IRIS² system, I can't possibly not have a presentation without including IRIS². So this is the infrastructure for resilience, interconnectivity, and security by satellite, and that's the S². It's a multi-orbital system of systems composed of a number of orbital shells. So we have a number of shells, LEO shell, a high LEO, what we call a high LEO, and we have a low LEO shell as an option at the moment, and then also a MEO shell. So the system itself is divided into governmental and commercial. So the governmental side there is shown in blue. So it'll be a shell of 18 satellites in MEO at around 8,000 kilometers. Then we have the LEO constellation of 264 satellites at around 1,200 kilometers. And then we have a low LEO shell, which will be a much lower constellation to serve the particularly low latency critical applications. And that's still being studied, so it's included as a TBC at this stage. But on the commercial side, we have the option to include our commercial players involved in the project, so SES and Eutelsat, to include their own satellites with their own capabilities to essentially take advantage of the constellation that we have for IRIS². So deployment will be from mid-2029, with services intended to be available from around 2030. And you can see that we have 2 logos. We have the European Commission, which is the leader for the program, but we're served also by the European Space Agency, who we are working with very closely to define the parameters of the IRIS² constellation. Next slide, please. And then finally, given the complexity of the regulatory regime in the EU and the many different regulatory domains, we are aiming to have a Space Act to improve the functioning of the single market for space within the EU. So this is aiming to help defragment the market, to simplify things, to provide a unified, stable, and predicted legal framework for space operators. And most importantly, it's to try to level the playing field for all operators. So it is not just going to be applicable to EU space operators, but also to operate any operator from outside the EU that wants to offer services within the EU. They will have to conform with the requirements of the Space Act. And it will be proportionate. It will be based upon the principle of proportionality. So it will not offer anything or not require anything that's beyond what is able to achieve the aims of the Space Act. So defragmentation and simplifying the space regulations. But it will also aim to protect the space assets themselves by having these requirements. So safety, you see there. So we will aim to have provisions in it that will aim to minimize the chance of collisions in space to avoid more space debris. That will include things like the requirement to deorbit, perhaps, and then resilience and security. So being in control of the satellites that are in space, ensuring that they are robust from the cybersecurity perspective is extremely important. And then, of course, the environmental aspect. So sustainability. So Ruth has already spoken about the many satellites that are in space and the needs to keep replenishing them. But actually, that's something that we are a little bit concerned about. So on the sustainability side, it's not just about keeping the orbits clear of debris and old satellites, but it's also about protecting the atmosphere, because when a satellite breaks up in the atmosphere, it creates pollution, or it may create pollution in the atmosphere. So we want to minimize that pollution and the impacts, which are still being studied. So we don't fully know what the effects are of this additional pollution in the upper atmosphere. So we aim to introduce something within the Space Act that will cover this element. And I say this is at the moment just currently in the draft phase, so it's not something that is set in concrete at the moment. We will be working with member states and working with the European Council and the Parliament for their approval. At the moment, it's a proposal by the European Commission, but our aim is that this will be helping to defragment the market within Europe and to help ease the access for companies that are wishing to offer service within the EU. So next slide is the takeaways from my presentation. So essentially to say that the EU is a dense, large market, has many regulatory borders, it's not fully harmonized. It has satellite favorable open skies policy. The RSPG is currently has a draft opinion, and we invite your comments on that process, well, the consultation on that draft opinion. IRIS Squared is coming. It's the EU's global secure connectivity constellation, and the Space Act, aiming to ensure sustainability, safety, and resilience. So with that, I conclude my European perspective on authorizing LEO constellations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I know that there have been lots of eyes watching not only the work to try and align some of the underlying not just regulations, but principles of the 27 EU member states, but also the Space Act and what that might yield. It's been a highly viewed topic, I think, overall, and we really appreciate you unpacking that regional perspective. So now we're going to turn to a national practitioner, George Puzera, who has, I think, taken Rwanda through a really fascinating journey, and particularly with satellite constellations. We're glad to have you here, George, and I'll turn it over to you to give the story from Rwanda.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Africa and Rwanda were not left behind in terms of LEO constellations. I would say, if you can go to the next slide. This also comes really to enhance the efforts that Rwanda and also other African countries have been going through to enhance space sector, of course, also including the connectivity aspect of it, really to enhance its development. Rwanda Space Agency, established back in 2020, set up a mission to establish a world-class space ecosystem, positioning Rwanda really to contribute and also to enable global space value chain. So if you can look at this, we have 6 areas that we do consider in order to enhance the space development of our country. And one of them is the regulatory framework. For simple reason is that really we want to position Rwanda as really a place to go in terms of space, enhancing capacity and capability of the country in terms of space technology, including, of course, the communication or part of it, and also empower the private sector. So the coming of the constellations also come in this line. Of course, we want to build this sector, grow it through collaboration, and also inspire the entire population around it. If you can go next. The big constellation, again, I'm not going to be dwelling on this slide since previous slides really talked about it, especially the one from Ruth. But I want you to see one critical aspect of the price that we have on African market. So on one hand, we have the traditional satellite that had some limitation in terms of latency, pricing, and so on, and also the capacity. But we have this new constellation that really, I'll say, comes really to bridge a very big gap in connectivity in Rwanda and also on the continent, but also comes with a relatively affordable prices, though it is not yet that much affordable. We still want to have more affordability in this compared to the capacity for people to purchase. So this really comes to address some of the challenges that we face. That's why really we were among the first nations on the continent to embrace this new constellation. And of course, that requires a number of measures in terms of the licensing that I'm going to be taking you through. If you can go to the next one. When we started receiving interest of different international companies that wanted to be licensed in Rwanda, of course, this new constellation came with a new way of operating that required us to go through the traditional licensing model that we had and adopt a new model. We were used to a traditional satellite that are mostly GEO that had a number of constellation. For instance, it was talked about, we need to have a local gateway in order, of course, to ensure the compliance of some of the national laws in place, including the one of providing facilities for lawful interception. And also we have a number, or say limited, of terminals, and licensing was really approached by each terminal. Relative also in terms of spectrum, we had a way of considering a spectrum per each terminal and be able to calculate relative fee. And traditionally, we used to have this big telecom satellite operators going through a local ISPs. And also we had a number of things like running rights that we were considering then. But now, when it comes to these new big constellations, so first of all, how can you require a gateway, local gateway? If, for instance, if you have the entire continent of Africa of 54 countries, imagine if the company that is about to provide services has to install a gateway in each country. That is 54 gateways on the continent. And one gateway is an investment of close to $5 million of CapEx without counting the OpEx. So we had to come up with a new way of licensing. And one of the things that we considered, again, keeping in mind that when we're approaching the licensing of this new constellation, for us, the goal, or the driving goal for us is really more, how do we connect our people? Rwanda and also other African countries are maybe this is the main part of the world where we still have a gap in terms of connectivity, especially when it comes to rural areas, because obviously the infrastructure development in terms of fiber connectivity, mobile connectivity is still limited. For Rwanda, we are a small nation. We are not that very much limited, but we are more limited in terms of the topography of the country. It is a very hilly country, and it becomes, and also we have a population that is spread across the entire country. It becomes a challenge to be able to provide the connectivity for mobile or fiber to everyone. And yet this is a commitment of the country to ensure that everyone is connected. So this really came to address some of the, one of the main concerns that we had as a nation, to ensure connectivity of everyone. So we quickly had to adapt to a new licensing regime, including some of the best practice across the world, including embracing blanket licensing, kind of review spectrum fees, and also this new constellation came with a new way of approaching the market, where actually people will have to install their own terminals without necessarily a local person to support. So these are new things that we looked into when we are approaching this new constellation. If you can go to the next slide. So we have two aspects of the licensing. The first aspect is the fighting with the ITU. Some of the companies would come to Rwanda wishing to register their constellation in the country. And Rwanda, as it was said, because only members of the ITU have that privilege to be able to register satellite constellations. So we have supported a couple of them to register their constellations. And there's a licensing regime that is dedicated to that, and with different requirements that we're going to see in the next slides. But also, we have another approach, maybe before you go to the next. Some satellite operators who would come, but they have, for instance, registered or filed their constellation in other nations, such as UK, United States, France, and others, but are more interested in providing services in the country. And also we have another licensing regime on how we approach those different categories of licensing. Next. Starting with the filing aspects. So this, you understand, is really more supporting those companies to register their constellation with the ITU. As it was shared by my colleagues in the previous slides or presentations, the main guide of us is the radio regulations. So we want to make sure that every aspect, every part of the radio regulations is complied with. And again, most of you, those who are familiar with the ITU procedures, we are very familiar with this aspect. But we do receive those findings, we look into them, and we check the different spectrum they want to cover, the size, we see the different orbiting, and all different information that are required to register within the ITU. And we check if they are compliant with the radio regulations. So, but before even filing, we want to make sure that really we consider what we have on the ground, even worldwide, because you understand a constellation is going to be operating in a global environment. It is important that we take into considerations other radio communication services that are existing in the world. And also, we cannot lose focus on the impact that constellation is going to be having on Rwanda, and also in Africa. We do not consider a country, Rwanda, as an isolated country, but we are part of the Africa. It is important that we always keep in mind whatever we do, how does it contribute to the development of the country and Africa? How does it contribute in bridging the connectivity gap of our country? but also it has to be aligned with that future development of Rwanda in terms of satellite industry and space in general that we talked about. We have a policy in place, a space policy and strategy that we do follow to ensure that we are not we are focused on the main vision of the country. Once we have considered everything, that's when we can go and submit that consideration to the ITU and go through the whole processes of the examination done by the ITU and the coordination requests that we do facilitate with different countries that requires a coordination with our operator to ensure that every step is followed until that constellation is notified and registered in the MIFR. Next. Now, when it comes to, if we can go next, if now we come back to the aspect of the licensing of services. As I said, the main drive behind any licensing that we do is it should be addressing some of the connectivity gap that we do have. We cannot just license someone just if we do not see a contribution in addressing the connectivity gaps that we have. And also we do check the national laws and the regulations that they should be complying with. And this is absolutely necessary that we want to make sure that, for instance, if that national law requires the lawful interception, we need to take that into consideration. And there are several other ways to comply with that requirement without necessarily having a gateway in the country. And we, as it was said before, we have a conversation with those operators and understand how that can be achieved to make sure that we do not break a national law, but also facilitate the operators to be providing services in a cost-effective way. We also check into the coexisting with other national communication services and of course assess the impact that it's going to be having with other communication providers such as MNOs and other operators in the country that provide connectivity services. We have to ensure that that particular person is going to be providing services with a good quality. So we require them actually to sign and provide SLAs, service level agreement with their customers, and we do check that if they are compliant to make sure that they do not provide the services but of very bad quality to our people. And the aspect of consumer protection is very important in Rwanda. We look into the affordability of services. We do not necessarily regulate the prices, but we check the affordability more or less. And usually when an operator wants to increase or reduce prices, there are always consultations. If you can go next. But we do not approach this licensing regime of the new constellation alone. So through the African Telecommunication Union, we do have some forums to come and discuss the licensing of such big constellations and also understanding the impact they have. There's, as of now, a paper that is being developed by the African Telecommunication Union to assess the impact of this big constellation. And we look into the opportunities, challenges, regulatory constellations raised by these new constellations, and also how do they contribute to provision of broadband services. We also focus on the potential impact on the existing market players, especially the existing operators, telecom operators, the value of the spectrum allocated to those services, and also how they do contribute to connect the continent. So this is still a paper under development that I highly encourage different stakeholders, including international, beyond Africa, to always contribute to make sure that we have that document that provides key information for every African nation that want to approach the licensing of these new constellations. And beyond that, personally, I do receive several calls and also visits of colleagues from across the continent who come to benchmark and understand different constellation we take into account when we are approaching the licensing of this new constellation. So it is more a regional approach that we want to work together to ensure that we license this new constellation in a more responsible way, and also towards addressing some of the connectivity gaps. Next. So, of course, we have a number of challenges that came particular with these new constellations that, of course, we do not stop the licensing, but we work together with those operators to understand how we address this. Some countries have brought, I don't want to put names, but an approach, I believe it is a way of reducing the cost for service provisions, really the local presences for supporting the consumers. And that's, for instance, when we started, we were receiving so many calls of people who want support for the installation, something is wrong and so on. And it was quite difficult to address those challenges, but we worked with those operators to make sure that they provide any support needed. And of course, also the customers, as they continue to use these services, they get the knowledge on how to install and fix things by themselves, and also seek support with provided means by those operators. We still have the payment issues, for instance, that most of the citizens in Rwanda, across the continent, use the mobile money for payment. Some of these operators do not provide these means for paying the services, but as of now, they are bringing in local resellers and representatives to be able to provide services to those people who cannot necessarily use a credit card and or a debit card for purchasing those services. But of course, we do work with them to address some of these challenges. So I think I'll end here. If of course there are some questions that the audience might have, I'm happy to take you to answer to take those questions. Otherwise, Patricia, this was really high-level summary of the African Rwanda, and also more or less African perspective in terms of licensing this new constellation. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, George. That was fantastic. What an interesting journey Rwanda's had, and what a very useful kind of unpacking of key considerations that you've helped us with. I want to turn now, we're going to go to a Q&A session. I have a bunch of questions, just as someone who's been listening in and intrigued by the remarks across the board. But I also want to tell anyone listening that you can ask a question. You can go to the button at the bottom of your page that says Q&A and click on there and just add a question. I think we'll also be tracking the chat if you want to add questions there. So first, I want to thank all three of you as speakers from sharing your hard-won perspectives on constellations. This is an intricate and fast-breaking technology that has really put policy and regulatory on kind of a speed round of reconsideration. I have a couple questions, and I'm going to start now. George, in particular, you mentioned the set of national strategic goals that Rwanda had established as you were thinking about constellations and satellites generally. that reached well beyond just the digital divide and consumer connectivity. And then, Dominic, you mentioned some space sustainability goals, like the impact of these constellations on the space environment that you're starting to think about within the EU. And Ruth, you mentioned, of course, effective spectrum sharing. For the three of you, I'd like you to think, do you have any advice on how to balance or weigh these various considerations: competition, frequency interference, digital divide concerns, other expectations or concerns for regulators who are starting to consider whether to permit services from a constellation? Um, Ruth, I'll ask you first, just because you had a little bit of a break from presenting, and see if maybe you have something you'd like to add.
Yes, thank you. I do think the individual national regulators have the last strongest opportunity to ask constellations, to ask new operators for good behavior. So if you want all of your population covered, if you want your existing operators protected from interference, if you want a fence around the Earth station so the cows from the farm next door don't wander in and get injured, you can ask for these things. Again, I encourage the regulators to bring the operator to you, ask them to come visit, have a conversation with them, talk about your concerns, ask what they can do as a company to adhere to your concerns, to help you solve the problems in your country, and not to be um, um, I'm not sure what the word is, not to be shy. Ask your questions. You won't
Yeah.
know as much about these things as they do, and that's okay. And you can ask them to answer. But I would also say you probably want these services. These are good things. You want to find a way to bring them to your country in a safe and respectful way.
Okay. I think that's a great encouragement. Dominic, do you have anything that you would recommend for regulators that you've seen in trying to broker across the 27 EU member states to regulators who are also still thinking about
Well,
this?
I was going to add that it's really the local regulators that know their population, and that's who they are trying to serve with the addition of these new services. So it's the local regulator is in the best position to determine what is the best way to serve their communities. Ruth is exactly right. The satellite companies know about their system. They know what they can provide. The telecom operators in the country know what they can provide, but it's up to the regulator to make the informed decision based upon the various factors. So it's really about understanding the market, understanding what the potential is for the use of the data connectivity that will be enabled by these satellite systems, or even other alternative systems, because satellite is not the only way to provide coverage within these countries. So it's really about understanding, and I think regulators can get that. If they don't have the information themselves, they can hire contractors to do studies, and that's something that we do in Europe. We have contractors that come in, so they survey the market, they do interviews, they find out what the requirements are within the individual member states, and then from that we get, as a regulator, the Commission is a regulator, we obtain an informed view of how the market can best serve the consumers in the EU.
That's very helpful. And George, I know you've given us a really detailed list of what Rwanda was considering. Are you seeing other primary considerations that are different in some of the other countries in the region that you've been coordinating with to try and build this kind of more regional approach? Or are the considerations pretty consistent? And I know we've got questions in the chat asking, what should we be thinking about? And I think, we're building that list right here.
Yes, thank you very much. I think, as my colleague said, you cannot do this without having a conversations with the operators. That was very, very important. Even for the case of Rwanda, we held several sessions of discussions, understanding what they are proposing. And also, you do not go to the operator when you don't know exactly what you want as a nation. It's very important. What are you trying to achieve? Sometimes regulators do lose sight of for what purpose they are regulating. We are regulating, in Rwanda at least, to address connectivity issue of our people. But of course, you cannot just address connectivity and license someone who is going to be operating at a global level without taking into consideration for instance, the sustainability. How is the system going to be coexisting with other systems? This is very important. So I would be frank with you and honest. When we started, we had no idea what to do. We had conversations. And you can trust me, even some of the advanced countries that have advanced in terms of satellite technology also had no idea how to tackle this new constellation. But it was important to be participating to several forums, be it at ITU, and talk to colleagues and exchange ideas and understand what are their considerations and take that into consideration in our assessing approach. But something that's very important is that there's two aspects of it. There's the more spectrum-oriented aspect of it, which is more discussed within the ITU. But also there's another aspect of sustainability and object in the space that is discussed in different forums within UNOSA. You cannot separate them. We need to be in both forums to have enough information to take into consideration licensing. Then coordinating with other colleagues in the region, exchange ideas, then you'll be getting closer to get it right. Though it's almost impossible to get it right 100%.
Mm-hmm. I was intrigued to hear the comparison between the groundwork that most countries already have in authorizing traditional geostationary satellite systems. And of course, there's also this larger bedrock of competition policy, telecom objectives, global economic goals that you might have for the country that help to inform what you've all been talking about. I'd be interested maybe in picking up a little bit more on the difference between the traditional satellite regulation that you maybe already have in your rule books, and what needs to be reviewed or maybe created for the constellations. And so this is kind of the second piece of advice to regulators who may be listening. Where would you advise regulators to focus most heavily? Where are the regulatory formats most needed to be adapted to consider LEO constellations? What's the farthest leap from what you've already got? George, for Rwanda's perspective, you're already a user of geostationary satellite services. What was new that you needed to add?
So obviously, to get rid of the traditional terminal licensing, it can't work. So how can you license, as of now, we have so many terminals in the country. Thousands of terminals. You cannot just approach one by one. That was really important to get rid of that. We have a set of terminals, get one license for everything. Of course, if they have a new type of terminal, so you have to take into consideration of that typical terminal, do the analysis for it, interference analysis and everything, then license and everything. Number two was really to find a way of not having the gateway in the country, because you cannot expect the operator to have a gateway in every country. But how do you achieve the same objective that you were going after with having a gateway? There are several ways. Satellite operators, when you approach them, they have several solutions now to address that. But you have to be open to having that conversation. Mm-hmm. Number 3 is to get away from those old thinking of, I need to have a presence, I need to have an ISP in the place. There are things that do not now work forever because our customers, our consumers have complete new mindset. They can do things by themselves online. They can plug and play and have connectivity. They are very sharp. They think very fast. So you need to adapt to them. Actually, some of the regulators sometimes lag behind the consumer. They see new cool product. They want them. How do you facilitate them to have them very quickly, but also ensuring the compliance of laws and regulations in the place?
Excellent. I mean, so we've got first the geostationary terminals tend to be either individually licensed or site-specific licenses. And when you've got thousands, if not tens of thousands of customers, that's not a practical way of licensing. So I assume blanket licensing, some sort of categorical license is the way to go. One of the things that we've been talking about within the ITU is looking for some best practices, some various approaches for regulators to be able to look at for which countries have taken what kinds of approaches. And then the second was the gateway. And Ruth, I was going to ask you if you could take the question that was asked to describe the difference from a regulatory perspective of a gateway connecting a constellation to the internet and a point of presence for the internet in a terrestrial context. Could you take that one on for us?
Sure. And George, you are absolutely correct about changing the approach to licensing the ground segment. And it starts with the language. Patricia, even the use of the word gateway, that's still where you want to have a license, where the communication enters your nation. But traditionally, that had to be a large hub earth station, one antenna. And those words became interchangeable in many regulations as written 20 years ago. Sometimes the word antenna or the word gateway or the word earth station. But with today's technology, those mean very different things. An antenna may not be the gateway into your nation. That is the point of presence, literally where the communication enters your territory. And as George said, it could be that the user terminal itself, the small antenna on the roof of a car or house, can have software that protects your national security interests, your concerns about privacy or encryption, whatever they are. Again, speaking with the specific operator is the best way to understand how they can serve your concerns, but also understanding that your issue is not really a piece of hardware. It is your national security, your consumers' privacy, the protection of the information in the link, not necessarily whether you have a specific piece of hardware on your country's territory.
That's really helpful to think about the regulation, not just in terms of the physical infrastructure, but also the objectives of protecting data for citizens or ensuring quality of service for security of a link. That doesn't necessarily need to be controlled by it being located in your country anymore. But it is certainly an important set of questions to ask the operator about how they're going to support your customers and how they're going to protect them and the services. In a shameless plug, I'm just going to note that the third episode of ITU Space Connect is we're planning to do that on the ground network so we can dig a little deeper into this. This is a complicated set of issues, and it's also probably one where there's the most maybe revision and rethinking to existing regulations for countries looking at this. So that'll probably be the last week of March. So stay tuned for that. That'll be on gateways and user terminals and potentially handsets for direct to device. So I also wanted to ask, where do you look for examples? Do you look for examples outside of your country or your region? Dominic, when you all were comparing the approaches from the 27 member countries, did you see a lot of commonality, or did you look at other regions and countries' regulations to guide your thinking?
So we looked primarily at the what member states were doing themselves. So, for example, going back to the space treaty, 12 member states have their own space laws, but they also have their own regulatory authorities. So we had to find a way, or we're looking to find a way to try to minimize the impact on those countries or those member states that don't have their own set of space laws, as well as integrating and not conflicting with their own processes for authorizing or licensing space services within their country. But we did also look at what was going on in other parts of the world. So the FCC obviously is very active in terms of space regulation. We looked at what the ITU itself was doing, and we looked at UNOSA, the activities there in terms of trying to create some kind of momentum for a common set of principles by which space actors have to adhere to, particularly for sustainability aspects. And that, in fact, going back to the previous question, that was probably the main difference between GEO and LEO constellations, is the huge number of satellites. So that introduces a whole new set of issues that not just about the space debris or the potential for space debris, but things like light pollution, which no one even considered. I mean, we talk about radio frequency interference in the ITU, but nobody really talks about light interference. So this is a completely new topic for us as satellite operators. So yeah, there's so many different things to include in what to consider when we are coming up with the Space Act principles.
So just as an aside, the radio astronomy and optical astronomy topic is one that I've been talking about for 5 years. So when we want to get back into that, I'm very excited to do it. But I also want to kind of just make sure that for the listening audience, there is probably a subset of countries whose priorities and interests are in becoming a host for a satellite constellation itself. So a subset of these issues related to the operation of the satellites, their interference with each other, may be not part of what you need to deal with if you're not looking at being the notifying state for an ITU filing or the licensor of a constellation on orbit itself. That bucket of issues could be apart from what you need to focus on. You can focus on, in Ruth's slides, the satellite services, the ground infrastructure, the gateways, and the terminals. That can be where you spend your time, as well as the kind of overlap of issues that that get to motivation and what the intent and goal is to introduce a new service provider into the mix. I wanted to turn now to the idea of spectrum management and effective spectrum. We've had a lot of questions in the Q&A about satellite spectrum, and I wanted to start with the first question, which is satellite spectrum is always shared. The LEO satellites are sharing spectrum with other LEO satellite systems. They're sharing satellite spectrum with the systems above in GEO. And in some cases, they're also sharing frequencies with terrestrial systems like microwave or 5G. What trends are you starting to see in spectrum sharing frameworks to reflect the advent of emerging LEO systems? How are you approaching this balance between the needs of the new LEO operators with existing satellite and terrestrial services? And I'm going to ask this question because it's important, but I also note we're in the Q&A session of a 2-hour policy discussion about regulation and oversight. This, you don't have to go into great detail. We'll have another session on spectrum specifically, just to give you a little bit of an out, because it's a deep and complicated topic, but I think one we need to touch on here. George, do you want to take this on first and just say how you in Rwanda were balancing the spectrum issues or any kinds of kind of abrasions and conflicts that you encountered that you needed to work through?
Yes, so of course you cannot talk about the new constellation without looking at the spectrum sharing. And it's
Yeah.
a very hot topic because this new constellation took almost everyone by surprise. So we spent several years at the ITU with more mobile spectrum versus geo spectrum, and of course other services. But now we have a new element, a new animal that comes with the request of a high demand of spectrum, and which is part of the satellite, but a different part of the satellite. But of course, we've seen a number of topics coming up. I believe the last two WSCs have always focused on how this new constellation do share the spectrum with the existing geo, but also the mobile. But as Rwanda and also most of the developing countries probably were the best positioned in those kind of discussions because we are more objective in terms of, because we don't have necessarily an industry very high developed in LEO then versus the GEO. So we do come with these discussions with open minds. So can we find a better way to share the spectrum? There's something that is very, very key. The technology also in terms of has improved in a way that allows the spectrum sharing in a way that was not possible before. So we're building on the radio regulations that were made several years ago, where we had a number of limitations in terms of spectrum reuse, in terms of flexibility of beams, and so on, that were not taken into account then. So it is now, I think, the main focus on the ITU that we are having conversations is how do we now take into consideration the new development technology and have a better, efficient spectrum sharing that, of course, allows everyone to coexist and provide services to our people.
Ruth or Dominic, anything you'd like to add on the question about spectrum? And because I've got a couple follow-ups, if you want to wait for those. Dominic, anything you want to add, or do you want to wait to see what else
I wanted to say something? I'm happy if she steps in.
Oh,
Ruth?
yeah, I mean, I did want to say a couple of things. This is super important. I want to emphasize that satellites all share. So the LEOs share with the GEOs, and any new entrants that come in also, they have to share. Unlike cell phone spectrum, each company gets its own exclusive band, and they usually pay a lot of money for that, right? There are auctions for cell phone licenses because they have the exclusive right. Satellites globally all share all the spectrum. And I loved what George said about the rules that were set up to protect the GEOs. About 25 years ago, the ITU had many meetings and they set up what are called EPFD limits. The power of the satellites had to be below a certain level so as not to interfere up into the geostationary satellites. But now that we're shifting to fewer GEOs and many more LEOs, that rule needs to be revisited. That's the kind of thing he's talking about. And also the new dynamic spectrum sharing softwares that make it more efficient and more able for multiple operators to be in the same spectrum at the same time without interfering. Incredible technology.
Yeah, so that's an excellent framework for the question that we had from Mozambique about how to address the spectrum scarcity And I wanted to just touch on this myself. On one hand, you've got kind of three tools to adjust to a new service. One of them is what frequencies are allocated to that service. What are your assignments, and what frequencies can you operate in? The second is the operating rules that you were mentioning with power limit, like EPFD or PFD, that constrain your operations within those service bands that you've been allocated. And the third is a technology fix, which is advances that allow you to squeeze more services in the same frequencies under the same power rules. And so those decisions, what frequency should you be allocated? And the second, which is what are the operating rules and the limits that are placed on you because you're sharing? And the last is what technologies can be developed to make the most of what you've got. Those are three dynamics that are happening right now in almost every conversation at certainly in preparation for the World Radio Conference. And I think they're very active conversations as a new service is like the satellite constellations are emerging and finding validity. And I just think for the ITU itself, that's its ongoing challenge, is to keep making those adjustments in any field where there are new services that are considered useful and valuable, to make room and make those adjustments. It's not a fast process, but it is, I think, an important one. I wanted to shift back to kind of a couple broader questions that were asked in the chat. One of them is from an African perspective. The question was asked: how can regulators balance national development priorities against the tendency of operators to go to nations that have more favorable regulatory frameworks? Like, how do you address having these high expectations that we talked about earlier, that you can expect, that you can start asking for in conversations with operators as they're approaching your country, with the idea that other countries might have easier or faster approaches? How are you seeing satellite systems flow into markets? And Ruth, as someone who plied the world with this for O3B, I'd be interested in your thoughts there. And then maybe I'll go to George to follow up.
I'm sorry, were you starting with me, Patricia?
Yep. Yes, I am, ma'am.
I actually do not think that companies forum shop. That's the term that lawyers sometimes use, looking for which country has, say, the easiest regulations. I think most companies start with their home nation, whatever it is, where they go to the regulator and start a discussion about the main licensing of the satellite system, being the ITU filing administration. But then what happens is you want to provide service in every other country in the world. So that market access or service license is something you will go to every nation for. And I think, again, I think both Dominique and George have spoken to how that national regulator has that power to have a discussion and make sure that the operator is complying with their concerns and really offers the service they want. It's it used to be that every nation could afford to finance a satellite that provided service just to its country. It was an efficient way, and also a great way to be a spacefaring nation. These systems start in the tens of billions of dollars. Every nation is not going to put one up. Also, as a business plan, that's a terrible idea for one small country to put up an architecture, an infrastructure that has to cover the whole globe. That's not the way to offer your service. So thinking about how to participate in that constellation as a provider of the service, not as an owner of the satellite, or perhaps manufacturing terminals or some part of the hardware supply chain, again, not as the actual owner of the satellite, might be a great way to get into participating with the constellation as opposed to being the ITU filing administration.
George, do you have anything to add to this? This sort of, observation that the service ends up being, unevenly available because the regulatory environments vary.
So obviously, any business person always focus on where there are favorable laws and regulations in place to facilitate his business. This is not applicable, not only just satellite constellations, but for any other industry. But there are two considerations that, two choices a regulator need to keep in mind when we are licensing anyone new or a new constellation. Either you are focusing on a citizen, the people you're supposed to connect. That is it really what you want? If is what you want, you have a way of framing your regulatory framework to allow you to achieve that. Or is it collecting license fee or spectrum fees? If it is that objective, there's also other way to address or to fix your regulatory environment to achieve that. But it's a matter of choice. So we cannot choose for countries. In Rwanda, we have our choices, but every nation has its way of choosing. But you cannot expect someone to come and invest in your country without setting up the rules or a regulatory environment that's favorable. That's almost impossible.
Yeah. I'm going to switch my hat here a little bit. When Ruth was expanding O3B and OneWeb and talking to regulators, I, at the same time, was doing the same thing for Starlink. And I can tell you that the choice wasn't just how difficult a market was. There was, at the outset, an understanding, an ability to understand the market, like an availability of rules, a sense of transparency. Ruth mentioned that that's a good practice, because if there is a pattern that you can follow, that you can understand at the beginning, you're much more willing and able to prioritize that country higher on the list of 190 countries that are possible. So that's one differentiator, which is just insight into what the rules and approach and priorities are. The second is, I think, George, you're right that there are reasons behind many of the rules and regulations that track directly to national objectives. But sometimes it's useful to reconsider whether those national objectives still weigh more heavily than the objectives that you have that could be met with a new service being introduced. So is that priority that you placed when you put that rule into the books a decade ago, does that still take priority over the goal of, let's say, reducing the digital divide? Those trades, I think, are worthwhile reconsidering. And then at the end of the day, the priorities that you have are well represented in your rules. That's the trade-off that you have. Those are the expectations that you have of a new service provider. And that may end up meaning that the service provider doesn't come as quickly to your market. And that's because you prioritize those rules. I just wanted to kind of offer that perspective.
Sure. No, just so the need to avoid regulatory shopping is one of the motives behind the Space Act we have in Europe to, as I said, to try and level the playing field in terms of, at least at EU level, for regulatory filings, for example, but globally in terms of provision of service.
Yeah, and from the operator's perspective, you've got you've got 200 countries to pick from. You've got some of them your network isn't yet able to serve, so some of it might be determined by your geography, that you're best suited to provide services to early on, because the nature of these networks is they're high upfront cost networks. You invest millions and millions of dollars billions of dollars in some cases to build this network. And until you get enough satellites and enough countries online, you're not even taking any revenue. So you're looking for countries that you can get in and start providing services with early on. There's an urgency to do that, not just because of the milestones that are set out by regulators in the ITU, but because you want to start testing out the service and bringing in some revenues. So so
Tricia,
differentiating. Yes, go ahead.
I wanted to really emphasize what George said and Dominic. The corporation laws are also important.
Mm,
So not
excellent.
just the harmonization of the spectrum regulation laws.
Mhm.
How easy or hard is it to operate a company, to
Yeah.
have a company, to establish a company? Are those rules easy or hard? Is the tax on my company higher than your neighboring country? That is also incredibly important when a constellation has to be operating in 190 different countries.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting discussion and debate that I suspect is going on in virtually every country that's considering constellations and how to reframe or revalidate the rules that you've got in place. One other set of rules we haven't talked about that was in a question from Senegal was about enforcement. How have you seen enforcement options for the expectations that are placed on satellite operators, and whether that's providing services? In the question, it was for services that were authorized without proper licensing, but there are lots of other expectations that you, I'm sure, are tracking to make sure that they're met. Dominic, I'm guessing the EU has some of the most well-established and well-defined enforcement mechanisms. How are you applying those to constellations?
Yeah, so enforcement is essentially down to the member states themselves because they have the responsibility for the spectrum in use in their country and the licensing of the services within their own territories. So it's their responsibility. But going back to what you said about authorizations, maybe beyond the EU, there is an agenda item for that for WRC 27, and I know some countries have very grave concerns about systems offering service within their country without a license or without authorization. So that is something that WRC itself would debate. But in terms of the EU, it's down to member states to enforce essentially the rules that they set for their licenses.
George, how are you approaching enforcement in Rwanda? The existing enforcement rules are simply applied, or is there something new you've had to do?
So the enforcement is probably one of the most complicated part of regulating new constellation, because we have limited tools to be able to do it, but there is always a way. And one of the approaches that Rwanda is using is really to work closely with the operators. We've set a number of conditions in their license. So how do we work together to monitor those conditions? So sometimes I'll go to, again, really being transparent and honest with the audience. I say, okay, we've agreed on this. How am I sure that we are doing this? He's going to come up with a way of demonstrating how he's doing that. But of course, he might trick you and don't do it and so on. But a good thing is the radio, it might trick it, but one day something will happen. Yet we have the rules that are written. How is he going to answer to that? So it's really more a balance of trusts, but also making sure that we have a set of rules that's very clear, and also working with that operator to make sure that you check the enforcement of those particular rules. But getting 100%, I don't think any regulator in this world will be able to enforce 100% the new constellation. They are extremely complex, and there's a new element on it And it's becoming difficult for regulators to be able to ensure that I have visibility on every part of it. But working together, you are able to, at least to a certain extent, ensure the enforcement of those rules.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of the early days of cellular development, where it was such a new service. It was so widely available and so broadly utilized that it was very hard to get a sense of whether they were operating under the rules that were envisioned and whether those rules still made sense or could be enforced. George, I want to pick up one thing that you mentioned in your comments. You mentioned that you and your colleagues have been providing support to Rwandan customers of satellite constellation services to kind of ensure a certain level of consumer protection. Do you have any advice to others about how you built those skills within your colleagues? How did you get smart to be, that level of support for your citizens?
Simple work with the operators. They provide those
Okay.
skills free of charge. And also, we're not going to be the one doing the whole job. The most important part is to ensure that the operator himself takes care of his consumers. We can chip in when there's a necessity to check and to ensure a customer has received the right support. Of course, if he does not provide that support, there are also some rules that are written on what happens. But first of all, work with the operators to build capacity of your own team, but also tell them, hey, make sure that you support the customers and you follow up on every case to ensure that customers receive the required support. But initially, at the beginning, it was crazy. We're receiving calls everywhere, and I was like, no, I'm not an operator. I'm a regulator. I'm not supposed to be the one to provide this kind of support, but it was necessary in order to get started. But now I don't even remember the last time I received a call about any customer complaint also.
We may end up having some kind of hotline to you to make sure others can follow in your footsteps. We're coming to the end of our session, but I want to explore two questions that are more related to competition that have come from our chat. One question from Colombia was, how do you consider, there are lots of constellations that are proposed. How many can you authorize? Is there a limit? How are you looking at the potential of multiple offerings when you're considering the rules that you develop? Dominic, with a current slate of satellite operators, Ruth did a great slide with the ones that are up and operating, and then IRIS2 coming. How are you thinking about that sort of full slate of potential satellite constellations?
Well, the Space Act itself will be one element, but I cannot give any details this stage because the Space Act is currently still in its development and needs to be approved at commission level before going to the council and parliament. But again, the member states themselves will be involved in licensing within their own territories. And my colleagues in DG Connect, which is responsible for EU policy on spectrum overall, are working closely with the member states to develop policies for the introduction of D2D services, for example.
Yeah. Ruth, have you seen any provisions sort of in your global perspective that limit the number of constellations, or are there other sort of provisions that would affect the sort of abundance of riches if all these constellations really do come to fruition?
I have not seen people concerned about limiting the number of service providers, and I don't think a country would want to do that. I think the concern is what's called carrying capacity. There's a engineering question about how many satellites can fit in outer space, or how many satellites can share the spectrum without running into problems or running into each other. And I think that that's actually not a real concern. I think that engineers just create smaller and more efficient satellites, and better ways to share. I don't think there is a physical limit on the number of satellites. I think that's the wrong way to think about the issue. I think you want to avoid interference, spectrum interference, physical interference, optical interference, and that's what your rules should concentrate on. Otherwise, allow a system to offer service in your nation.
I'm a little bit concerned by that answer, actually. There's no
Okay.
physical limit. I think there are genuine concerns about the number of satellites in orbit, which is one of the reasons we're looking at that quite closely. Physically, there has to be a limit, and the more satellites there are, the more the probability of interference, collision goes up, and this is something we have to take into account. We cannot just keep loading the orbits with more and more satellites, even if they become smaller.
I do think that's one of the areas for those that are considering the licensing or oversight of constellations themselves, not just their services or their ground networks. That's such an active topic, which is what expectations of performance and safety capability should be put in place for operators. What consequences are there for having an increasing number of satellites? What tools or techniques might there be? And what trends are we seeing? I think if you haven't watched our first episode, we had some really good discussions about the drivers and the enablers of satellite constellations and the question about whether, how to assess the proposals against who's really going to fly and just how hard this business is, and whether that might self-limit the number of systems that actually come to fruition.
Maybe I can add something on what Ruth said about the frequency aspect. So at higher frequencies, it becomes easier to fit more systems in because the beam sizes become narrower. I always imagine a model of satellites with pencil beams down to Earth and pencil beams coming up from the Earth. So the narrower those pencil beams are, the more systems you can fit in, and that works at higher and higher frequencies.
Yeah, I do think that's, in those sort of toolkits of how to expand a new service, improvements in technology are certainly one of them. Yes. At the end of the day, this is an awfully complicated area, and I go back to the silliness of calling this the Wild West. This is, hardly an unregulated or unconsidered area. And at the end of the day, the reason to look at these complicated issues and wrestle with them and grapple with them is because there's the prospect of new services that have usefulness. And I think, George, you gave us a really good sense of what the outcome is of regulation. And I would just sort of ask that as the final closing question. How do you hope that these systems affect your citizens and how that shaping up in the regulations that you've set up? Are you pleased with the effect that your regulatory approach has yielded? George, I'll ask you first.
Yes. So again, Rwanda has really more a unique approach, really focusing on that particular citizen who need connectivity. And when we opened services for one of the constellation provider or operator, and everyone was asking, why would I want to have a satellite connectivity? I mean, why? When I have fiber and mobile? Because Rwanda is a small country, and we've done a pretty much good job in terms of connectivity across the country because it is easy to do, small country. But we're surprised when we open to find even in the cities, people with fibers in their home are still adding a terminal for constellation because they have good quality. And we've seen people with fiber connectivity providers who had started to take it for granted, promising someone will be telling you, you're going to be having around 100 up to 100 megabytes per second of experience, but connect the entire neighborhood, and that shared capacity shrink, and you never experience even 1 megabyte per second. So it was a wake-up call. So when we have a competitor, they started now providing better quality of service. It tremendously changed the market, impacted the market in a positive way. But also we had a number of schools and hospitals in the rural areas that was very difficult to connect using existing ways, mobile and fiber, that were in a single shot connected, and you put a LAN inside the school and you have the students starting to enjoy digital services. It was really positive. Of course, regulators, we have to deal with those sort of rules and so on, but the citizens were pretty much impacted in a very positive way.
That's really helpful to hear, because this regulatory mess that you have to get through is not for the faint of heart. It's good to know that there's a reason to do it, and a positive potential impact if you handle it thoughtfully, which I really appreciate all of you helping us consider what that looks like. So we're now reaching the end of our session. I want to thank all of you in the audience for your attention and your good questions. Thanks to your engagement, we've kept our speakers on their toes and covered more ground than even I thought possible. I hope this discussion is a springboard for future exchanges. This certainly isn't the last time the ITU will host a forum to discuss this topic, and how the traditional satellite frameworks can extend to constellations, where new approaches are needed, and where some thoughts on best practices are going forward. So the slides presented today and the video of our conversation will be posted on the ITU Space Connect website and also on various social media. In case you want to revisit these comments or share with others who couldn't join us real time, or if you want to check out our first episode. As you'll see here, we're going to ask you to consider joining us again to continue this conversation and discuss in more detail ground networks, the gateways and customer terminals that underpin satellite constellations, and approaches to license and approve them. We're working on the dates. It'll likely be the last week of March. Stand by for that. And then also the ITU is building the team is building an online portal for a treasure trove of information about satellite constellations, but also the full complement of space-related policy, regulatory, and technology topics. The link is on the slide. Please keep an eye out there as we continue to grow that resource. We'll also be setting up the next expert panels for the roughly monthly cadence we're setting out. A host of upcoming episodes on current topics to inform and inspire you for this most fascinating and dynamic time in space. So I want to thank the ITU for bringing us all together. Thanks to our awesome speakers for their candor and expertise. And thanks to you all for being a part of the ITU Space Connect. Until next month, farewell.
Thanks.
Bye.
Recording stopped.
Thanks to my fellow panelists. Good session. Well done.